Good afternoon. Welcome to Thank you for joining us. Welcome to I Was Just Thinking. I'm Rudy Maxa, travel journalist and broadcaster. Nice to have you in the house today. I've got a fascinating guest. His name is Simon Winchester. I'll tell you about him in just a moment. He's going to actually appear in the corner of your screen. He just went to get a copy of a book to show us in a few minutes. We've been doing this for quite a while this summer. There he is there. Simon Winchester is a very erudite, very clever man, as my English granddaughters would put it. He's quite a funny guy. I've known him for a long time. I'll tell you a little about him in a minute, but we're going to talk with him about the Mississippi River that I actually live on here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and why it might be someday a problem for the United States. Here's the picture book. This is a picture book that Simon wrote about the Mississippi River, that he wrote the copy to accompany the photographs about the Mississippi River. And we're going to be talking about another book he wrote called The End of the River, and he'll explain that title in a moment. You just saw a copy of The End of the River on the screen. I invite you to join us on my YouTube page, which is SavTrav, short for Savvy Traveler, SavTrav49, and you can see some of our past shows with Paul Theroux, with it's just a whole long list of people. You've maybe seen some of them, but it's a great Phil Rosenthal from Somebody Feed Phil, and Andrew McCarthy, the actor. We've had some great people on, and Simon is one of the greatest. You can watch those being replayed on YouTube. If you want to subscribe to my free weekly newsletter, go to maxatours.com, scroll down to the bottom of the page, and it's a gossipy newsletter every week on travel around the world. I first met Simon Winchester when we were both on a press trip sailing down the Yangtze River in China before the Three Gorges Dam was built, before they destroyed the homes of tens of thousands of people and villages in order to make that dam. And we might talk about that dam because it's having a little water problem these days too. We might talk about that during this hour. I got to know him a little better when he was in Hong Kong. He lived there for years as the Asian bureau chief of Condé Nast Traveler. He's an incredibly ambitious explorer, an incredibly fast writer, judging from the number of books he writes. As a writer myself, I am in awe of that he can write these books and also research them about fascinating destinations around the world and more. His New York Times bestseller, which I particularly liked, is called The Professor and the Madman. It's a story of the man who developed the Oxford English, who invented, basically, put together the Oxford English Dictionary. I know the story. I'm going to ask Simon a little to describe it as well a little later on, because it's a book is still in print and you really ought to read it. He also wrote a great book on Krakatoa, which was the volcano that erupted in Indonesia in 1883 and is, by many standards, the most destructive volcanic event in history. It caused over 36,000 deaths, one volcano eruption. That's how violent it was. The map that changed the world. We might talk about that too. And Pacific. Pacific is a collection of almost discrete magazine pieces about inventions and events that happened in the Pacific that shaped that part of the world. In short, he's a Renaissance guy. He's quite clever, as I said, my granddaughter would describe him. And I'm delighted to have him on. Simon, welcome to the big show.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rudy. Lovely to see you again.
Now, let me understand, because The End of the River is coming out, or has just come out in this summer in audio form, and this is a book. Well, let's back up. When I saw you a couple of years ago here in St. Paul, which the Mississippi, trust me, until I first came to Minnesota, I did not know the Mississippi River was even in Minnesota, but I now overlook it from my apartment. You were here because you were writing copy to accompany that picture book you held up a moment ago. Photographs about the Mississippi River. And then it turns out you wrote your own book on the Mississippi River called The End of the River. Can you hold up the picture book again?
Yeah.
You said it's quite beautiful. Who was the photographer?
It's true. There it is. It came out a few days ago. What the story of this is that there's a photographer called David Fraser, spelled Frwese, who's a professor of photographic studies at one of the colleges in Philadelphia. And he came up with the idea some years ago now of chronicling from the air the entire west coast of North America, from the Aleutian Islands all the way down through British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, right down to Baja California. And because it was so geologically interesting, would I provide the text? Well, I did, and the book came out about 7 or 8 years ago, and it was within the milieu of photo books. It was quite successful. So he then did the same thing with the East Coast, going from the very northern tip of Ellesmere Island in Canada, right down to Dry Tortugas, which is the little fort off Key West. And I provided the text for that. And then he approached the Transamerica Corporation, that has that pyramid in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
And they liked those two earlier books. And he was keen to do the Mississippi, as it were, the middle coasts of America. So he very kindly asked me again to provide the copy for that. And this time, instead of taking these pictures from the air, which is, you might imagine, tremendously expensive, he got a drone and learned how to fly it and got his license. So he used a drone and came up with this. I mean, I know we're not really talking about that, but this
did you say it just came out? This book?
Yeah, I think it came out last week, actually.
Oh my goodness! I thought it had been out a year or so.
No, not at all. So it begins with this sort of
little
epic
creek in northern Minnesota called Itasca.
Yeah, Lake Itasca, which is a completely made-up name. It sounds like a Native American name, and not at all. The interesting thing about this picture, and I believe you may, I'm not going to bore you to death with it, is that it was decided in the 1930s that America's most noble river should have a noble beginning. And up to that point, the Mississippi sort of seeped out of this lake through a sort of swamp. And they decided it needed actually to have a start. So underneath those rocks that you see there, and built there by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression, 600,000 tons of concrete, which make an artificial beginning to the Mississippi, so that it starts in an attractive way that tourists will go to.
Can you tell that when you visit? Can you tell when you visit that there's all that concrete underneath?
You're not aware of it. It's completely hidden. You learn about it by reading about the Civilian Conservation Corps and what they did. So the essence of the book, really, in a way, is to say that everything about it, from Lake Itasca, where it begins, down to what is called Head of Passes, where it comes out into the Gulf of Mexico, is entirely artificial. There are dams, there are wing dams, there are locks, as you know only too well, in St. Paul. And so it's a monument as much as anything to human engineering, because if it was left to its own devices, it would go completely berserk and would wander about wherever it wants to, which is, in a sense, what this other little book, The End of the River, is all about. But I'll leave you to ask me questions about that, because otherwise I'll just...
we are going to talk about that. But first, I want to tell you that I have lived in Minnesota for 20 years. I'm not a native of here, as you know. I'm an East Coast guy, but here I am. This is going to shock all my friends who live in Minnesota when I tell them that Itasca is not a natural creek, that there is 700 tons of cement that the Civilian Corps put. That's incredible. I've got to stop this webcast now and go tell everybody, because this is just an amazing revelation.
You must also be careful not to confuse cement and concrete.
Oh, that's
cement
right.
Concrete's got bits in it, and engineers will jump down your throat if you say cement.
Right, this is concrete. And I should also point out to our viewers that Simon is, by training, a geologist.
Yes, long time ago now, yep.
But that has informed many of his books, and I'm sure it informed the book, The End of the River, that we're going to talk about now. Okay, so that was the picture book, which just came out, called Looks Like the Mississippi. It looks like all the photographs when you're flipping through are black and white, though.
They are all there, and beautiful pictures, all taken, I think they're platinum prints or something. And David, well, as you can see, this is somewhere in Louisiana, I think. No, actually, no, Iowa. But yes, beautiful sepia prints, and there isn't any color at all in the book.
Interesting.
It's all the more powerful as a result, I think. It's called Mississippi River, Headwaters and Heartland to Delta and Gulf.
Okay, so you wrote the copy for the book. He took the pictures with the drone, and he's an expert at that. And did that then suggest your book, The End of the River?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I'd actually known about this problem, which we're going to be talking about before, but only when I got down to that part of the river, which is near the big prison in Louisiana called Angola, famous or infamous prison, that I then thought, I'll go and look at this problem and then maybe write a piece about it. And then I sort of forgot about it, tucked it away at the back of my head. And then this organization called Scribd, which I still think is one of the most ugly publishing names around, came along and said, would you like to write a piece for us? 12,000, 15,000 words, something that interests you. And I said, well, I'm actually very interested in this potential problem in the lower Mississippi River. And they said, sounds like a plan. We described it to them and they said, sounds like a plan. So Scribd, they commission the audio and the digital. In other words, you'll never see a physical book. So the print rights are still theoretically available, but on the other hand, there isn't much of a market for 15,000 word books. But so it's doing quite well as audio and digital. So you get it from scribd.com, I think.
Script being SCRIPT, like script, like paper script?
To make it even uglier, it's SCRIBD, Scribd. It's a horrible word.
Scribd, got it. Okay. So what is the problem, which is what your book is about? What's the problem with the Mississippi River?
Well, if I can put it like this, the Mississippi generally flows north-south. When it gets to sort of northern Louisiana, another river comes in essentially from Oklahoma, from the central west of the United States, and it's called the Atchafalaya. And these two rivers come very close to each other. You've got the Mississippi here, the big fellow, and the Atchafalaya, and at one point, 3 miles away, very, very close, all these U-bends and things, very close, and crucially, 20 feet lower than the Mississippi. So the Mississippi, like all rivers anywhere, wants to find the lowest possible, the quickest way to the sea. And the quickest possible way to the sea would be to break through these 3 miles into a valley which is 20 feet lower than itself, and then gush down into the Atchafalaya and go to the Gulf that way. Well, that problem, which is a man-made problem, and without a map and all sorts of things, it's really difficult to explain, other than to say that we know the villain. The villain of the piece is a man called Henry Shreve, who invented the stern-wheeler ship, and he dug a cut in the Mississippi near where all this nonsense is going on in order to make it more economical to get up and down in his big fancy ships. And that caused an unforeseen, not an unforeseeable, but an unforeseen problem, which was to make the Mississippi really eager to jump through its channels, get into the Atchafalaya, and flow southwards. Well, if that were to happen, it would mean that the river would no longer flow through New Orleans or Baton Rouge, which would have devastating economic consequences. So the American government thought about this for a long time. And you've got to remember the Mississippi is run and has been run for almost all of American history by the Army. The US Army Corps of Engineers builds all the dams, all the locks, all the wing dams, everything to keep the Mississippi, which is regarded as a vital highway of commerce, to keep it in its banks. Well, they saw this problem and decided that they would try and alleviate it by, and this is where it gets really complicated, but essentially building a series of dams to prevent the Mississippi flowing into the Atchafalaya.
Okay.
Well, the first dam they built essentially got destroyed. Now they built another one. That is coming under threat because of, and I know some of your listeners may not accept this as a reality, certainly our president does not, because of global warming and climate change. But it is an inescapable reality that floods on the Mississippi are gathering in frequency and in amplitude, in height. And the more pressure it's put on this one dam, one day it's going to break. And if it does, catastrophe.
Now, so describe that catastrophe for us. What I mean, will it wipe out everything in those 3 miles in between the two rivers?
Well, yes, but in a sense, that's rather trivial. If it starts flowing into this sort of narrowish stream called the Atchafalaya, it'll do all manner of destruction. It will, for instance, there are 2, if not 3, interstate highway systems. All the bridges would be destroyed. 4 major railroads, the BNSF, Union Pacific, other east-west lines, are positioned in that part of the United States, their bridges would presumably be destroyed. Millions of acres of cropland would be damaged. Towns would be inundated. It would be an economic catastrophe. It would certainly have sociological and economic ramifications, which one doesn't even wish to imagine. I mean, think of all the chemical plants, the refineries, the oil and gas pipelines. They would be severed or damaged. So, but more than anything, it would bring to an end New Orleans. I mean, there would be no... New Orleans is defined by its river and its riverfront. It's a gigantic container port for a start. Most of America's, or much of America's grain exports go down the Mississippi from the farmlands, up in Iowa and Nebraska and so forth, come down the Mississippi and are put on ships and sent off to China and Africa and wherever. New Orleans would stop being a port. The only port that would receive the Mississippi's waters, now diverted, is a town you've probably never heard of. I certainly hadn't. Morgan City, Louisiana. That would first of all be inundated, but then they'd have to rebuild it because that's where the new mouth of the Mississippi would be. And anyway, that's in summary what would happen. So Baton Rouge and New Orleans would be ended as primary cities. The river would flow 50 miles to the west, and the economic complexion of the southern part of the United States would be radically changed and forever. And Mark Twain, I'm so sorry to interrupt, Twain predicted it all, because he said when he was in that famous book of his, memorializing his work on the Mississippi, he said the Mississippi is uncontrollable. You can have all manner of Mississippi River commissions, and of course the headquarters of the Mississippi River Commission is in Vicksburg. You can have as many armies as you like attempting to control it, but the Mississippi will go where the Mississippi wants to go. And at the moment, the Mississippi, under this well-known hydrological principle called avulsion, wants to go down the Atchafalaya. Now I'll stop talking.
Well, that disaster scenario has got everything going for it but nuclear power plants.
Right. I'm sure they can find one that's in the path of it somewhere if you look hard enough.
So what is the, a quick question, I want to ask two questions. Chris McLaughlin would like to know, if the dam failed, it would be a sudden burst or a gradual dribble? It sounds like the former.
No, it would be pretty catastrophic. What happened, if you can imagine, it was, I think, in sometime in the 1970s or 80s, there was a huge flood in the upper Mississippi, which did terrible damage to dam number 1, which still exists. Now, dam number 1 has, and I'm going to cast around, because there isn't a print version of this that I can look at to remind myself, but it's got, let's say, 10 gates that are raised and lowered to allow the Mississippi, some of it, because there's sort of an agreement that some of the Mississippi must be allowed to go down the Atchafalaya. To be exact, 70% must be allowed to go down the mainstream, 30% must be allowed to go into the Atchafalaya. That makes everyone's happy with that split. So these dams perform that split. So when there was only one dam, they do this by raising and lowering dam gates. And there are people who every day, based on information from the National Weather Service about how much water is coming downstream, play with these things like a sort of piano concerto, opening and lowering these huge gates and letting water out or damming it up. Well, a ferocious storm broke in the middle of the night. And the thing that raises and lowers these on this particular dam is on a sort of railway which goes along the top of the dam, and it's a crane which lifts up a gate or lowers it. And the engineers who were working that night, they could hear this terrible sound of the water roaring through the gates, scouring. There's what are called wing dams, which channel the water in towards the dam. One of them became totally destroyed. And they were going to get on the crane and roll it down to start lifting up these gates. But all the engineers, quite reasonably, were too terrified to get on because the whole dam was shaking and the wind was ferocious. So they decided to let it go on its own, and it trundled through the night and managed to get to the other end. And then someone raced like hell over the dam and started to lift up the gates. But then came the word from the River Commission, said, don't do anything, just leave it be and pray that the dam will hold. And it sort of did, but they said never again. So we'll have to dig another channel and make another dam. And that they did. And that other dam was designed by no less a person than Albert Einstein's son, who was working as a hydrologist over in Berkeley. I think it might have been Stanford. So he came over and said, well, the way you've got to design this secondary dam is, and they don't have the railway thing, everything's sort of electronic now. And that is called the whole kit and caboodle is called the Old River Control Structure. And the dam we're talking about, they have the most banal names. It's called the auxiliary structure. So the auxiliary structure of the Old River Control System is the thing to watch for. If that were to fail, yes, to answer your question, it would fail catastrophically. And then the Mississippi, there's no stopping it. Once it starts, once you've lost control of the river, there's no getting it back. Welcome, Morgan City. Goodbye, New Orleans.
Well, there you go, Chris. By the way, she's a fan of your books. Chris is a fan of your books. I think I know it's a he or she, at KRISS. But you pointing out that Albert Einstein's son designed that auxiliary dam goes to her comment, which is, Winchester finds the most interesting details to weave into his books. And he does. Every one of his books is chock-a-block with factoids and surprising things that you have to call out while you're reading and say to who's ever within earshot, wait till you hear this. Any of these books you see right now on your screen, Professor Madman, Map to Change the World, Krakatoa, Pacific. Read them. Now, keep in mind, The End of the River is only an audio and digital version. The other are books that you can order on Amazon anytime. Okay, so the logical next question is, what does the Army Corps of Engineers, who you say is responsible for Mississippi River, have to say about the prospect of a break that would cause this horrendous thing to happen?
Well, they say, and odd enough, I've just been watching and just finished it this morning, this, and I must commend it to anyone who's interested in great engineering projects as I am. I've just been looking at the Challenger disaster 4-part Netflix series, which is stunning. And the engineers responsible for that, there was so much hubris, so much pressure on them, political pressure. And I detect much of that in the attitude of the Army Corps of Engineers, who said to me when I was sitting in their office in Vicksburg, you know, we can, if the Mississippi starts to rise uncontrollably, if we get torrential rains, huge snow melt, because remember, Mississippi, there are so many feeder streams, not the least of them being, of course, the Ohio, which joins at Cairo, and of course the Missouri. I'd forgotten about the
Missouri River, yeah.
Well, in the North Platte and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. They say no matter how much water it sends down to us, we can throw as much iron and concrete at it as we can dream of. We can keep it back. To which I'm tempted to say, I'm sorry, Mark Twain reminded you that you can't, that sooner or later it'll do what it wants to do. And I'm afraid that's something that they don't, well, who am I to say? But I think they don't get it, that sooner or later natural forces, and really avulsion is a fancy way of saying gravity, soon gravity will determine which way the Mississippi goes, and it won't give a hoot for how much cement is put in its way.
Now, drawing on your geology background a bit, explain, please, why, I mean, you said that if the Mississippi had not been channeled the way it is by the Army Corps of Engineers and others in the early days, it would just be, what, some massive floodplain in the middle of America? What geology, I mean, we have sandstone cliffs here on both sides here in St. Paul, Minnesota, the Mississippi River. Isn't that sort of a natural path for it?
Yes, in the upper Mississippi, I mean, the Mississippi is divided into, from the Army Corps of Engineers point of view, into 3 areas. I mean, the upper Mississippi, which goes from Itasca up through northern Minnesota, down to you, and that's where the first locks are, first navigation locks. And then we have the middle Mississippi, which goes all the way down to Cairo. And then south of that, there are no further dams, no further locks. And all they need to do is to keep a channel dredged so that these enormous barges, you won't see many of them up where you are, but further down.
They're parked right outside my window, Simon. They're parked right outside my window.
Yeah, but not the really big fellows with dozens and dozens of barges.
Ah, okay.
So, I mean, they're a phenomenon of the middle and lower Mississippi. They're full of iron ore, taconite from the Iron Range up near Evelyn, Virginia, Mississippi, Minnesota, I might say, or grain.
Soybeans.
Soybeans, indeed, off to China, of course. Yeah. So that lower Mississippi, and I wish I could show you these extraordinary maps. I don't think I've got one showing. They were done by a man in the 1940s. Some of the most beautiful maps we've ever seen, showing the intersecting patterns of these historic oxbow lakes. And they're just beautiful things to behold, but it reminds you that the Mississippi is changing its course all the time. And there have been stupendously big floods, which have displaced tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, the big ones was it 1929 or 1934? The population of impoverished southern people in cities like Detroit and Chicago is largely due to the flooding in the Mississippi, which caused a huge migration northwards because the river spread. By one stage, it was something like 100 miles wide.
No.
It inundated millions of people.
What year was this?
I think the big bad one was 1934.
Oh my goodness! I had no idea.
It's the worst catastrophe in American history until Katrina, of course, another Mississippi-related problem. So they have this system of levees. I mean, we haven't used the word levees in this chat so far, but they have these levees and these what are called flood paths, where they deliberately destroy levees to allow the river to flow out into. They have levees up near Cairo, which have got tubes in them full of explosive. And they can, at a moment's notice, although they discuss it in great detail and permission is rarely given, to put fuses in and blow up these pre-drilled explosive charges inside the levees and destroy it to alleviate the pressure further downstream. It means that farmers upstream will lose their livelihoods for a few years, but that's reckoned a small price to pay. And then you've got these enormous floodway, the Bonnie Curry floodway in New Orleans, and two others, huge constructions. I mean, the size of the engineering works that keep the Mississippi in its place, keep it disciplined, are unimaginable. You and I have seen big dams, I dare say, like the Hoover Dam and the Shasta Dam. They are as nothing compared to the big dams in the lower Mississippi.
By the way, you probably couldn't hear it, but I just heard a ship horn behind me from the Mississippi, which is literally a stone's throw from my balcony here. Why would you blow up a levee if the water's rushing down? Can't you just let it roll over the levee? Why would you have to explode it or dynamite it?
Well, because if you wait long enough for it to overtop the levee, then it's already done the damage down. It's threatening New Orleans or one of the cities. So you've got to preempt it and say, we'll blow the levee now to reduce the pressure on the downstream.
All right, so I'm glad I rent here on the Mississippi and don't own.
Good idea. Don't own on the Mississippi, right?
Now let's talk about a couple of other of your books. One of the favorite ones of mine is The Professor and the Madman, and I will just tease it a bit. The Professor was the gentleman who thought he would like to collect the first usage of many English words and create a dictionary, which is now known as the OED, or the Oxford English Dictionary, with precise definitions and early usage. And he solicited mail, I guess in those days, mail from anyone anywhere in the world who could find an earlier usage of the word, I don't know, dog, who knows what, in English. And the Madman, well, who was the Madman, Simon? Your title, The Professor and the Madman.
The Madman was a man called William Chester Minor, W.C. Minor, who was born in what was then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, of missionary parents, from New Haven, Connecticut, and he was a bit of a scamp, and they sent him home when he was about 13 to an aunt in New Haven. He was very, very clever. He went to Yale, he studied medicine, became a surgeon, and was sent to join the Union Army. And his first battle, in which he was a surgeon, was the Battle of the Wilderness in northwestern Virginia. And one of the occurrences, which was relatively common in the early days of the war, was that there were Irishmen fighting on both sides as sort of mercenaries. They also, the Battle of the Wilderness was a particularly unpleasant one, and there were a lot of desertions. There was one Irish deserter who was caught, and the punishment for deserting was to have the letter D branded on your cheek with a hot branding iron. And the colonel of the regiment said, W.C. Minor, you're the doctor, brand this man. And somewhat against the code to do, first do no harm, but you're evidently doing some by branding somebody. And he balked at it, but in the end did it. And promptly went mad. I mean, he deteriorated rapidly, suffused with guilt for what he had done, eventually was thrown out of the American army in disgrace. And his parents in New Haven said, oh dear, perhaps he ought to go, and he's a good painter. He plays the violin or the flute. Let's send him to London. We're friendly with John Ruskin, so he can tutor our son, our poor, evidently unstable son. So W.C. Minor went to London, and he took with him, fatefully as it happens, his American service revolver. And he was paranoid in his belief that Irishmen were going to attack him for having branded one of their own on the battlefield. And so he shot one dead. An innocent man called George Merritt, who was working as a late-night stoker in a brewery. And Minor got out of bed and saw this man walking down the street, says, Irishman, come to get me. Bang, killed him. And the police came, and he said, yes, it was me. I did it. I had good reason. I thought he was going to kill me. And it was the first shooting death in London. And he appeared before the judge, who found him innocent by his evident clear insanity, paranoid schizophrenia, you'd call it today, and committed him to a mental hospital. And it's a sentence still used in Britain to this day. Until Her Majesty's pleasure be known. So in other words, life until the Queen or the monarch decides otherwise. And so here's old W.C. Minor sitting alone, thousands of miles from home, in a mental asylum called Broadmoor, which is a hospital which still exists outside London, a place called Crowthorne in Berkshire. And he was rich and well-born, and so they gave him two cells, one which had a fireplace and he'd smoke his pipe and play his violin, and the other a library, considerable library of books. And he wrote to the widow of the man he had killed, Mrs. Merritt, and said, I'm frightfully sorry to have killed your husband. Is there anything I can do I'm sitting in this cell. And she said, that's awfully nice of you. I'm very poor and you're very rich, so a bit of money would be nice. And so he gave her a substantial amount of money. And she said, I'd like to come and visit you because I feel very sorry for you. And it was all genuine and sort of really rather lovely. And so she petitioned the warden of the lunatic asylum, and she was allowed to visit him. And basically they fell in love. And he persuaded her to bring him books. That's more, he wanted books more than anything. So every month she would bring a big package of books to his cell. And one day in the 1870s, when he'd been in prison for maybe 5 years, between two of the volumes she brought him, she was called Eliza Merritt, was a little brochure, and he read it. And it was put out by James Murray, the editor of this new book, which was to become the Oxford English Dictionary. And Murray said, I am attempting to assemble meanings of all the words ever used in the English language. a near impossible task unless I can get a small army of volunteers to read books and to send in to me quotations which show how a particular word, you said dog, dog is a verb, to dog someone. Dog is obviously a canine thing that barks and wags its tail. It's also a kind of nut. It's also sexual, all sorts of meanings. So whenever you find a meaning, send it to me here in 79 Banbury Road, Oxford, and we'll gradually assemble this catalogue of words. So Miner thought, I have nothing better to do. Why not? And so he worked started in the 1870s. He was still working, and then I think on the letter Q, as it happened, in 1901, when something terrible happened and he stopped working.
Right, like almost 30 years?
Yes, 30 years.
30 years.
According to Murray, he was the greatest of all contributors to the OED. But the remarkable thing is that every time they finished a letter, A or B or C, Murray would have a big party in Oxford and they'd invite all the contributors. But Miner would never come and would never explain why. He always, because it was known as a hospital, a psychiatric hospital, James Murray thought, well, he must be one of the staff. Had no inkling that it was anything worse. And there was this wonderful moment when finally, when they were on the letter E or F or something, another party, no Miner appears. Murray says, well, if the mountain won't go to Muhammad, Muhammad will go to the mountain. So he got on a train. You can imagine the scene. Murray, a very distinguished.
This is because Miner had contributed so many.
So much. By that time, 10 or 15,000 words. So Murray cycled down to Oxford Station, got on a train which took him to near this hospital. There was a carriage which picked him up, clip-clopped through the lanes of Berkshire, deposited him at this huge Victorian mansion. A servant led him upstairs into a room where there was a distinguished-looking man sitting behind a desk with books all around him. And Murray bowed and said, very good afternoon to you, sir. I am James Murray, the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary. And you, sir, after 30 years of hunting, you, sir, must be my most esteemed contributor, W.C. Miner. And the man behind the desk rose and said, thank you for everything you've said, but I regret to say I'm not Dr. Miner. My name is Orange. I am the proprietor of this place. I run this asylum, but Dr. Miner is indeed here. But I have to tell you 3 things about him. Number 1, he's a lunatic. Number 2, he's a murderer. And number 3, he's an American. I'll take you to him directly. And so these two met, looking almost identical, long, white, swallowtail beards, thinning hair. And they met and from the get-go loved each other. Because although the one, Murray, a figure, a pillar of rectitude, intellectual, the other, a murderer, they were united by this passionate love for the English language.
And the book is called The Professor and the Madman, and it's an incredible story. My guest is Simon Winchester. You've seen some of his books put up here on the cover. Wayne wants to know if The End of the River will be published as a reading book, he calls it, as a conventional book.
I know, a reading book. Isn't that a charming antiquarian phrase?
I like it. Yeah.
I like it too. I would like it to be. But as I mentioned at the beginning, if you're a poet, you can have a slim volume. Somehow, I have the rights, so I suppose I could. In fact, I have a printing press. I think part of it you can see behind me here. I suppose I can print it myself. It's possible, but it's sort of chugging along quite nicely as an audio book and which I read, I hasten to say, and as a digital book. But I would love to see it as a reading book. So I'll do my best.
One of my favorite beginnings of any book review is this slim volume, comma. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. By the way, just to return for a second to The End of the River and the Mississippi River, Randy asks or suggests, and I've done this, but I want to do it again now that you and I have talked, and I'm sure you did. Randy suggests getting a tour someday at St. Anthony Falls, which is right in downtown Minneapolis. The falls are in the Mississippi. They're very tiny falls, by the way. He says, get a tour someday at the St. Anthony Falls near you. That would be me, if you haven't already. Lots of really cool fluid mechanics research is done there related to the river and much else. Did you spend some time there when you were here, Simon?
I did. And there's There's a lock and a dam upstream of you.
Yeah.
North, I mean, considerably. I mean, 30 or 40 miles further north, if I remember. And then the river becomes very languid, still under the control of the army. But it's where one of the places where the Ojibwe Indians have the right to grow wild rice. So I find that a particularly fascinating part of the river. I was up there with my wife in the depths of winter, and I took a picture of her crossing the river in the first bridge across the stream. I'm terrified because I barely swim, but she's crossing on this little rickety thing. So she has crossed over the first bridge, and the lowest bridge must be, golly, I don't know where it would be, but somewhere down near St. Louis.
It's just a pedestrian bridge.
Oh, it's not even that. It's just a log, flattened at the top. And if you fall in, it's only about a foot deep, and it's perfectly clean, which cannot be said of the Mississippi further down.
Exactly. Well, in the winter, I can understand why you wouldn't want to fall in even a foot of the Mississippi River. And I know when you were here, I remember what a terrible day that was. We had breakfast that morning. I know I asked you only to stay for 40 minutes, but would you just stay long enough to tell us a little about The Map That Changed the World, one of my other favorite books of yours?
Yes, I'm happy to, although I'd love to be able to have an opportunity to talk a tiny bit about my next book, which comes out on January the 9th.
Well, The Land. We're going to have you back on for The Land. No question.
Well, you're all right. Well, in that case,
Simon has a new book out called A Look at Private Ownership of Land.
Yeah.
You can describe it better in a phrase than I can. Go ahead.
Well, no, it is a book about, my wife and I were talking about the whole idea of the enclosure of land, because after all, the common lands of England and Wales, famous book here, common land owned by everybody. And then in the 18th century, 17th century, people started saying it's ridiculous having common land. Let's put fences around it and own it. I'll have that bit, John, and you have that bit, George and Rudy. And so land suddenly becomes privately owned. And once it's privately owned, it's an asset because it never disappears and you can borrow money on it. And that's the basis, if you like, of capitalism. So it had enormous consequences, which then were transferred, of course, to the United States, with Jefferson talking about a nation of yeoman farmers, each owning and improving small tracts of land. Well, the trouble is, of course, that land was hitherto owned by somebody else called Native Americans. And so the whole question of ownership I find completely fascinating. Is it right? Is it moral? I mean, I'm not like Proudhon. I don't believe all property is theft. But I don't know that it's right that someone like Ted Turner should own 2 million or John Malone 2.25 million acres, or that Gina Reinhardt in Australia should own 39 million acres of land. Well, she's the biggest landowner on the planet, apart from the Queen, of course, who owns almost everything, but only notionally. So I spend the book looking into this. And of course, it is the visible end of the invisible part, which is what William Smith was interested in the book you very kindly mentioned, called The Map That Changed the World. And that was another of these. I mean, I had written lots of books, none of them at all successful, until The Professor and the Madman. And this is a book which is about 19th century lexicography. Who would think that would sell even 50 copies? But for some reason, it sold astonishingly well. And
not only was it a New York Times bestseller, I'm sure it contributed to. Simon is the recipient of the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, bequeathed by Queen, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Bequeathed by the Queen.
Yeah.
I think I have it in my drawers.
Do you have?
I think I do. Yeah, here it is, tucked away.
Let's see here. There it is. The OBE. You can open it?
I can open it, yeah.
Give him the big screen there, Michael. Give him the whole screen. There it is. Okay. Surprised you don't have it on your sweater. That's very good looking.
Well, I'm British, we're modest about these things. Someone said about Mr. Attlee, a modest man.
Yeah. Okay. So
modest about.
So The Map That Changed the World certainly drew on your background in geology, and this was a everyday farmer who questioned why, when he was digging up his land in the middle of the UK, there were seashells or or rocks with imprints of fish life on it. Is that a good beginning?
You've got it absolutely right. And basically, he had this epiphany. I mean, it was a classic epiphany. No one had ever thought of this. If you have a series of rocks, let's say, there's a limestone with a fish bit in it, and underneath it there's a siltstone with a ammonite in it, and underneath it a shale with a snail in it. And that same order, fish bit, ammonite, snail, is in another series of rocks 10 miles away. It's likely that those two rocks are the same thing, only it's disappeared and it's underneath. So he figured that if he went around England observing where rocks and their fossils erupted, as it were, onto the surface, he could speculate with some accuracy on where they were underneath the surface. And he could therefore draw a map of the invisible underneath of England and Wales. And so he spent 15
we would call the strata, right?
Yes, the strata. He was known as Strata Smith. So he spent 15 years under, in conditions of great poverty, tramping from all the way from Cornwall way up to the Scottish border, and produced a map which, quite honestly, is almost identical to a map of the geology of the United Kingdom today, drawn by men with GPS and lasers and satellites and all the rest of it. It's a beautiful map, and the original hangs in the Geological Society of London, Piccadilly, opposite the big store, Fortnum and Mason. And it was behind a curtain. No one really noticed it. And I thought, I'd like to tell the story of that map and the man who made it. And it is an extraordinary story of an unsung hero, a sort of forgotten figure. So that book still sells. So that enables me, and I'm incredibly lucky to make a living, a modest living, from writing, which in the non-fiction world doesn't happen. I'm not James Patterson, but
James Patterson. Can I underline the fact that map, that hand-drawn map that he made, still hangs at the Royal Geological Society on Piccadilly Road, right across from the big department store Fortnum and Mason, and you can go view it. And I remember after reading Simon's book when it came out years ago, the woman who had to lead you up there and pull the curtain back to show it to you because they didn't want it harmed by light was really getting tired of Simon's fans showing up at the Geological Society. Yeah. We know every time we walk in, I read this. Yes, okay, we'll take you up and show it to you. Don't take a long time. And it's all because of Simon. And there was a Geological Society, a Royal Geological Society, while he was doing this.
Yeah, but they wouldn't let him be a member.
Yeah, they wouldn't let him be a member because he was some poor farmer who had some crazy notion that maybe
under his fingernails.
Water at some point.
Yeah.
But when they sort of figured out he might be onto something, they appropriated his map, and he wound up going to debtor's prison because he had no map to sell anymore because they were the Royal Geological. And a wealthy millionaire came in, got him out of jail, and over the years did battle with the Geological Society and won his name back. And you came along to make him famous in our time.
It's a lovely summary, Rudy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very well. We're running out of time. I want to tell you that book is called The Map That Changed the World, and you can see it next time you're in London. Go to the Geological Society. They'll be happy to show it to you.
Now it's completely. They've changed the entrance totally. They put it in the entrance. It's so easy. The only trouble is
they pull the velvet curtain back, and now they got so tired of having to do that because of his book, because of Simon's book, that they reconfigured the entire entrance to the building. But it's right there across from Fortnum Mason, open during the day to the public. Do go see it and carry a copy of his book. I've got to tell you, Simon, you've been very generous with your time. I thank you so much. Every one of his books is fascinating, as one of our viewers said right in the beginning in our notes, what's it called? Our what is this? A chat column. In our chat column, that Simon finds the most illuminating and impressive and exciting details on almost any subject he turns his hand to. And when Land, his book coming out in January, comes out, you can bet I'm going to be begging him to come on and spend a little time with us. Simon, I know you got a farm to manage there in Massachusetts. Thank you for staying with us. Good to see you, and I hope to see you soon in person somewhere.
Thank you so much, Rudy. Lovely to see you, and take care of yourself up there in the soon to be frigid north.
Soon to be frigid. Thank you, Simon. If you click, I think if you click the red telephone up there, you will be free of us. And I just wanted to share a little news with those of you who don't get the newsletter, a little travel news this week before I say goodbye. A casino in Vegas has actually banned smoking beginning the end of this month, end of September. It's the, it's the Park MGM. Now, this is not the MGM Grand, but it's part of the MGM family. It's a very nice modern hotel called the Park MGM Grand, and they have a hotel within a hotel there called the Nomad, Nomad. Smoking will be banned there as well. It's the first Vegas casino to do that. I am delighted as a guy who, I mean, there are a couple very nice Indian casinos around where I live here in the Twin Cities. I might go once a year or once every 2 years, and I immediately have to put my clothes in the laundry afterwards because the smoke is so bad. Vegas does a better job of exfiltrating. Is that a word? I don't know. Getting the smoke out of the air, but still it's there. And I would love it if if every casino did that in the world. And one of the great hotels of the Gilded Age, Chicago's 1,000-room Palmer House, will not be reopening after the COVID era ends, when it ends. It's a Hilton note. It's flagged by the Hilton note, still called the Palmer House, Hilton Palmer House. Defaulted on its $337 million mortgage. It also had additional financing, mezzanine financing of $94 million a year. It still owes. Now, that hotel has come back. After a year after its grand opening, it burned in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 and was rebuilt in 1925, so it could come back. Morocco has just opened its borders to American visitors, should you want to go there. And if you're an American Airlines flyer, American has announced this week it will open 7 more of its clubs in October. It's already got some of its clubs open at its hubs, its airport clubs, excuse me. And here's the big news for American flyers at the clubs. Avocado toast is coming back to American Airlines lounges. They are bringing it back. And Gary Leff, a colleague, a travel writer whose blog is called View from the Wing, also reports that American Express is reopening its Philadelphia and Seattle Centurion lounges October 5th, and it's going to expand its Vegas and LaGuardia clubs, airport clubs, and opening new lounges in JFK, Heathrow, and Denver, Colorado, later this year. So that's the travel news as I know it today. I want to thank you so very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed Simon Winchester's presentation. I love talking to that guy and listening to him. He's amazing. Follow us on YouTube. You can look by going to SavTrav49. You'll see all our past interviews called I Was Just Thinking with some very interesting people. You can subscribe to my newsletter by going to our tour company website, which is maxatours.com, maxatours.com. Scroll down to the homepage and you can register there for yourself or some friends who you think might like it. Meanwhile, we'll see you again next Thursday with another episode of I Was Just Thinking. Travel safely if you are traveling. I know not many of us are. I'm going to try to sneak over to London in 2 weeks. I'll let you know how that goes on that webcast in a couple of weeks. Take care, and thanks for joining me today.